If you keep asking yourself why you feel stuck, listen carefully. The answer may not be that you are lazy, lost, or incapable of changing. You may be trying to force yourself to remain inside a life you have already outgrown. And the dangerous part is that nothing around you has to look broken. The job can still work. The relationship can still exist. The routine can still look completely normal. But when your old life can no longer hold who you are becoming, staying begins to cost you more than change. Before you cross that door, you need to know whether you are simply afraid or whether a chapter of your life is truly over. The known has tremendous power over us. It may be painful, but it is predictable. It has rules, it gives us a name, it tells us where to stand and how to explain ourselves. The unknown offers no such immediate comfort. It does not guarantee success. It does not promise that everyone will understand. It may require us to become beginners again, to disappoint expectations, to admit that an old dream is no longer ours, or to walk forward before the next identity has fully formed. That is why people often choose a familiar form of suffering over an unfamiliar possibility. They know how to survive the room they are in. They know which floorboards creak. They know where the light enters and where the air becomes thin. They have learned how to shrink themselves so the walls do not hurt as much. The open door, by contrast, reveals only darkness. It does not show the whole path. It only reveals that another space exists. This journey is about that door. It is not about destroying your life impulsively. It is not about treating every difficult season as proof that you must leave. It is not about romanticizing uncertainty, abandoning responsibility, or calling fear intuition. Growth does not always mean departure. Sometimes the honest path is to remain, repair, apologize, learn, endure, or finish what you began. But there are also times when staying is no longer loyalty. It is self-abandonment. There are times when perseverance becomes a disguise for fear, and stability becomes the language through which an old identity keeps you from changing. The challenge is discernment. How do you know whether you are facing a temporary difficulty or the true end of a cycle? How do you honor what carried you without remaining trapped inside it? How do you cross from one identity to another when there is no complete map? How do you grieve a version of yourself that was once necessary? How do you move responsibly when certainty is unavailable? How do you avoid using change as an escape from the very patterns that will follow you through every door? These questions cannot be answered by slogans. They require honesty, patience, and the willingness to look at your life without immediately defending it. They require you to separate discomfort from danger, grief from regret, longing from fantasy, and courage from impulsiveness. They ask you to examine not only what you want to leave, but also what you are prepared to build. The door beyond the known is not always a physical departure. Sometimes it is a conversation you have postponed for years. Sometimes it is the first boundary you set without apology. Sometimes it is the decision to stop living from a family story that no longer defines you. Sometimes it is returning to study, ending a destructive pattern, releasing a title, beginning a creative life, asking for help, or allowing yourself to become someone your past could not have imagined. Whatever form it takes, the door appears when remaining unchanged begins to cost more than transformation. You may not feel ready when that moment comes. Readiness is often misunderstood. We imagine that one day fear will disappear, confidence will arrive, and every practical detail will organize itself into certainty. But most meaningful transitions do not begin that way. They begin with partial clarity. They begin when one truth becomes undeniable, even though many questions remain unanswered. They begin when you can no longer pretend that the present still fits. The unknown is frightening because it refuses to introduce you to the person you will become before you start moving. That identity is not waiting fully formed on the other side. It must be built through action, correction, failure, discipline, and time. You do not cross the threshold as the finished version of yourself. You cross as someone willing to learn. This is why the first step often feels so exposed. The old identity has evidence, it has history, it has witnesses. The new direction has almost none. You may have to act before other people can see what you see. You may have to protect a fragile beginning from those who only know how to relate to your former self. You may have to tolerate being misunderstood without turning that misunderstanding into hatred. But you are not required to know the entire future. You are required to recognize the truth of the present. Throughout this journey, We will examine the signs that an old life is ending, the psychology of familiarity, the grief of outgrowing yourself, the corridor between identities, the false demand for certainty, the difference between growth and escape, the cost of returning, the first step without proof, the practice of becoming, and the moment when the door finally closes behind you. The purpose is not to push you toward a dramatic decision, it is to help you see clearly. A door should not be crossed because a voice on the outside told you to leave. It should be crossed because you have become honest enough to understand what remaining would require you to sacrifice. If you are standing at the edge of a change you cannot yet explain, take a quiet moment to subscribe and continue this journey with us. This space is for those who are willing to walk beyond familiar identities and listen carefully for the life that is beginning to emerge within them. Now return for a moment to the room behind you. Look at it without contempt. It may have sheltered you, it may have taught you, it may have been exactly where you needed to be for a time. But ask yourself one question with complete honesty. What happens when the life you know can no longer hold the person you are becoming? That question is the handle, and the door has already begun to open. Chapter 1. The signs that the old life is ending. A life rarely announces its ending with a trumpet. More often, it begins to withdraw from you in silence. You continue performing the same tasks, but the meaning that once moved beneath them is gone. You smile in the same rooms, answer the same messages, and repeat the same plans. Yet something feels strangely absent. At first you assume you are tired. You tell yourself that a vacation will fix it, that a new goal will restore your motivation, or that you simply need to become more disciplined. Sometimes that is true. Human beings pass through seasons of fatigue, doubt, boredom, and frustration. Not every low point is a doorway. Not every difficult relationship must end. Not every profession that becomes demanding has betrayed your purpose. But there is a difference between a hard season and a completed chapter. A hard season still contains a living connection beneath the difficulty. You may be exhausted, but some part of you still believes in what you are building. You may struggle with a person, but honesty and repair remain possible. You may feel uncertain, but the path still calls you toward growth. Difficulty asks for strength. A completed chapter asks for truth. The first sign that the old life is ending is not pain alone. It is the persistent loss of inner participation. Your body arrives, your schedule continues, your responsibilities are fulfilled, but your deeper self no longer enters the room. You are not merely tired of the effort. You are tired of pretending that the effort still belongs to you. This can be difficult to admit because many of us were trained to respect endurance more than alignment. We were praised for staying, tolerating, completing, and proving ourselves. We learned that changing direction meant weakness, ingratitude, or failure. So when an old identity begins to loosen, we do not listen. We accuse ourselves. We say, I should be grateful, I should be stronger, I should want this, I worked too hard to feel this way. Notice the language. The word should often appears when the life we are living and the truth we are feeling have moved apart. There is nothing wrong with gratitude. Gratitude helps us recognize value without entitlement. But gratitude becomes a prison when it is used to deny reality. You can be grateful for what a path gave you and still recognize that it has ended. You can appreciate a person and still know that the relationship can no longer continue in its current form. You can honor a profession, a community, a belief system, or a former dream without remaining permanently bound to it. A chapter does not become meaningless because it closes. Another sign is the increasing cost of self-translation. You begin to spend enormous energy explaining yourself to yourself. Every morning requires a speech. Every decision must be defended. You rehearse reasons to stay because the experience of staying no longer supplies its own reason. You build intellectual arguments around a life your inner world has already stopped choosing. This is not the same as facing resistance before meaningful work. Important work often produces doubt. Growth can be tedious. Commitment requires action on days when inspiration is absent. The question is not whether the path is always pleasant. The question is whether the difficulty is serving a living direction or protecting a dead arrangement. Imagine two people waking before dawn. The first is training for a demanding profession. The work is difficult, the hours are long, and many days feel repetitive. But beneath the fatigue, there is a sense of becoming. The struggle is connected to values, skill, contribution, and a future the person still recognizes as meaningful. The second wakes to continue a life built entirely around an identity that no longer feels true. The work may be easier, the income may be stable, the external rewards may be greater, yet every task requires an inner contraction. The person does not feel challenged. The person feels absent. From the outside, the second life may look more successful. From the inside, it is slowly becoming uninhabitable. A third sign appears through repetition. You make adjustments, but the deeper problem remains. You change the schedule, take a break, ask for different responsibilities, improve communication, reorganize the environment, or set new goals. These changes may help temporarily, but the same quiet conclusion returns. This is important because discernment requires more than a single emotional moment. If you have never attempted repair, you may confuse an untreated problem with a completed chapter. But when sincere efforts have been made and the central disconnection persists, the pattern deserves attention. Ask yourself, have I tried to make this situation more honest, more sustainable, or more aligned? Or have I only distracted myself from it? Sometimes the end of a chapter reveals itself through what no longer inspires envy. You once looked at people farther along the same path and wanted what they had. Their success appeared as evidence that your sacrifice would be worthwhile. Then something changes. You imagine reaching the highest level available in your current direction, and instead of excitement, you feel trapped. The future that once motivated you begins to look like a larger version of the room you already want to leave. This is a powerful signal. We often focus on whether we dislike the present, but the deeper question is whether we desire the future to which the present is leading. If nothing changed, except that you became more successful at your current life, would you want that life more? The answer may be uncomfortable. Another sign is the return of an abandoned self. Interests you buried begin to reappear. Questions you dismissed become persistent. You feel drawn toward conversations, subjects, places, or forms of work that seem unrelated to your established identity. This does not automatically mean you must reorganize your entire life around a new fascination, but it may indicate that a neglected part of you is asking to be included. An old life often ends before a new vocation becomes obvious. The first movement may not be toward a specific destination. It may simply be away from chronic self-abandonment. There are also physical and emotional signs, but they must be interpreted carefully. Persistent tension, dread, numbness, irritability, sleep disruption, or exhaustion can accompany a life lived against oneself. They can also arise from medical conditions, mental health challenges, financial stress, caregiving, trauma, or circumstances that require professional support. The body is not an infallible oracle. It is a source of information, not a complete verdict. Listen to it, but do not turn every sensation into a spiritual command. The purpose of awareness is not to create a dramatic narrative. It is to gather honest evidence. One useful distinction is the difference between expansion and performance. Expansion may feel uncomfortable, but it creates more capacity. Performance may look impressive, but it requires you to disappear. After a difficult day of expansion, you may feel tired and alive. After a day of performance, you often feel empty and unreal. Another distinction is between fear and violation. Fear often appears when something matters. You can be afraid of a path that is deeply right for you because it requires growth. Violation feels different. It is the repeated experience of acting against values you can no longer betray without consequence. Consider a woman who spent 15 years building a career that gave her family stability and earned admiration. She was capable, respected, and financially responsible. Nothing had collapsed. Yet over time, she noticed that the future available to her required becoming more deeply committed to work she no longer believed in. She did not quit after one difficult week. She did not call discomfort destiny. She spent months examining her finances, values, obligations, skills, and options. She tried changing roles. She reduced unnecessary commitments. She spoke honestly with people she trusted, the conclusion remained. The problem was not that she had failed. The problem was that she had succeeded at becoming someone she no longer needed to be. That realization did not tell her exactly what to do next. It did something more important. It ended the argument about whether her inner conflict was real. Many people remain trapped because they demand that the next life appear before they admit that the current one has ended. They want replacement before release. They want proof before honesty. But endings and beginnings do not always arrive together. Sometimes the first truth is simply that the old arrangement can no longer continue unchanged. This does not mean you must leave immediately. Recognition and action are different stages. You may have responsibilities that require planning. You may need savings, training, legal guidance, medical care, housing, support, or a safer environment. A truthful transition is not made less authentic by preparation. In fact, responsibility often protects transformation from becoming another source of chaos. The question is not whether you can abandon everything today. The question is whether you are willing to stop lying to yourself about what is happening. Take one area of your life that has felt increasingly narrow. Do not judge it yet. Do not declare it finished. Examine it through 3 questions. Is this difficult because growth requires effort? Is this painful because I am avoiding responsibility, communication, or necessary change within the situation? Or is this draining me because the chapter has genuinely ended? Do not rush the answer. Look for patterns across time. Look at what happens when you rest. Look at whether repair restores meaning. Look at the future your current path is building. Look at how often you must silence yourself to remain. Then ask a 4th question. What truth have I been trying to make temporary because I am afraid of what it would require if I admitted it was permanent? The end of an old life is not always visible to anyone else. There may be no ceremony, no announcement, and no immediate movement. Sometimes it begins with a private act of recognition. You stand in the room that once held your dreams, place your hand against the wall and admit that it cannot expand with you. That admission is not the crossing, but it is the first time you stop pretending there is no door. And once the door has been seen, another question arises. Why does the familiar still feel safer than the truth? Chapter 2. Why the familiar feels safer than the true. A person can remain inside a painful life for years and still feel terror at the thought of leaving it. From the outside, this appears irrational. Why protect what drains you? Why defend what has already proven incapable of giving you peace? Why return to the same relationship, the same pattern, the same role, or the same internal story, when you already know its cost? Because the mind does not automatically choose what is healthy. It often chooses what is predictable. Predictability gives the nervous system a sense of orientation. Even when the terrain is harsh, it is known. You understand its rules. You know which words start the argument, which silences follow, how disappointment enters, and how you will recover afterward. The suffering has a schedule. It may hurt, but it does not surprise you. The unknown offers no such structure. It contains possibility, but it also contains variables you cannot control. You do not know who you will be without the familiar role. You do not know whether the next path will work. You do not know who will remain beside you, how long the transition will take, or whether you will regret the decision. The mind compares the certainty of a known wound with the uncertainty of an open field, and often chooses the wound. This is why familiarity can disguise itself as safety. Imagine someone living in an old house with a leaking roof. Every time it rains, water enters the same corner. The person knows where to place the bucket. The floor is warped. The walls smell of dampness, and each storm requires the same exhausted routine. Then someone offers access to a new piece of land and the materials to build. The land has no leaks because it has no roof. It also has no walls, no familiar rooms, and no guarantee that construction will be easy. The old house is objectively failing, yet it feels safer because the person knows how to survive it. Many lives are maintained in the same way. We confuse competence in managing dysfunction with evidence that the dysfunction is secure. We become experts at tolerating what harms us. We know how to lower expectations, hide needs, anticipate moods, postpone dreams, and explain away disappointment. This competence creates an illusion of control. Leaving would require becoming inexperienced again. The fear is not only of failure, it is often the fear of losing identity. Every familiar environment tells us who we are. A profession gives us language, status, routine, and a place in the social order. A relationship gives us a role. A family system assigns us duties. A belief system explains the world. A community reflects a version of us back to ourselves. When we consider departure, we are not merely asking, "What will I do?" We are asking, "Who will I be when the old mirrors no longer recognize me?" That question can be more frightening than unhappiness. People around us may reinforce the familiar because our change creates uncertainty for them. If you have always been the reliable one, they may interpret your boundary as abandonment. If you have always been agreeable, they may call your honesty selfish. If you have always pursued a respected path, they may treat a new direction as decline. Their reaction does not always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from the loss of the version of you that made their world predictable. This is why truth can feel socially dangerous. We are relational beings. Belonging matters. Approval is not meaningless. Human beings survive through connection, and the fear of exclusion is deeply rooted. But there is a difference between allowing relationships to inform you and allowing them to permanently define what you are permitted to become. The familiar also gains power through investment. The more years, money, reputation, sacrifice, and emotion you have placed into a path, the harder it becomes to evaluate honestly. You begin to believe that leaving would make the investment meaningless. You say, "I cannot stop now, I have given too much," but the past cannot be recovered by sacrificing the future to it. This is the trap of sunk cost. We allow what has already been spent to determine what must continue to be spent. We stay in a declining project because of the money already lost. We remain in a harmful relationship because of the years already shared. We continue pursuing a title because we trained too long to admit that our values changed. The investment may have produced learning, discipline, connections, experience, and wisdom. Those remain. A path can end without erasing what it taught you. The question is not whether the past was wasted. The question is whether continuing is still worthy of the life that remains. Another reason the familiar feels safe is that it protects us from responsibility. As long as we remain in the old structure, we can blame the structure. We may complain about the job, the family, the city, the economy, the relationship, or the expectations placed upon us. Some of those constraints are real. But the moment we choose a new direction, we become more responsible for what follows. Freedom is attractive in imagination and demanding in practice. The open field offers possibility, but it also asks you to decide where to build. There is no familiar wall to blame. There may be no one to tell you whether you are doing it correctly. This is why some people repeatedly approach change, then retreat. They do not only fear losing security, they fear becoming accountable for their own authorship. The mind also prefers a known emotional identity. If you have spent years seeing yourself as overlooked, trapped, misunderstood, unlucky, or burdened, a new path threatens more than your routine. It threatens the story through which you interpret yourself. Even a painful identity can provide coherence. Who are you without the battle you have described for years? Who are you if the person who hurt you no longer occupies the center of your decisions? Who are you if you succeed and can no longer use impossibility as protection? These questions reveal why change can create resistance even when it is desired. The old life may contain suffering, but it also contains familiar explanations. The unknown may require you to release not only what happened to you, but also the identity built around it. This does not mean you should distrust every desire for stability. Stability is valuable. A safe home, dependable income, supportive relationships, predictable care, and practical routines can make growth possible. The problem is not stability itself. The problem is using the word stability to describe a structure that requires ongoing self-erasure. True stability supports life. False stability prevents movement by making fear look responsible. To distinguish them, examine what the familiar asks you to pay. Does it require ordinary compromise, patience, and effort? Every meaningful life does. Or does it require chronic silence, dishonesty, diminished health, abandoned values, repeated humiliation, or the permanent postponement of what matters most? A structure may be familiar, and still be unsafe. A transition may be uncertain and still be honest. Consider a man who remained in a position he had outgrown because it gave him status. He knew the work no longer reflected his values, but the title protected him from feeling ordinary. He imagined leaving and saw himself explaining the decision to friends, relatives, and former colleagues. The fear was not merely financial, it was the fear that without the title he would become invisible. For years he said he was waiting for a better opportunity. In truth, he was waiting to feel certain that his identity would survive the loss of the old mirror. Eventually, he began making smaller experiments. He taught a class on weekends. He spoke with people working in fields that interested him. He reduced debt. He developed skills outside his official role. These steps did not eliminate fear, but they revealed something important. His identity was larger than the title he had used to contain it. He did not need to leap blindly. He needed to stop treating familiarity as proof that no other life was possible. The unknown becomes less terrifying when it is approached through evidence rather than fantasy. You can gather information, create savings, test ideas, seek counsel, study, volunteer, negotiate, and build alternatives. The goal is not to make the unknown completely known. That is impossible. The goal is to reduce unnecessary risk while accepting that some uncertainty is the price of movement. There will never be a transition in which every variable is controlled. The desire for total certainty is often the familiar life asking for one more delay. Take a situation you have been reluctant to change. Complete this sentence without trying to sound brave or wise. I remain here because leaving would force me to face. Perhaps the answer is uncertainty. Perhaps it is loneliness, loss of income, judgment, failure, responsibility, or the possibility that you will discover your old life was not the only life available. Then ask yourself, what part of that fear can be prepared for and what part must simply be carried? Can you create a financial plan? Can you seek legal or professional guidance? Can you strengthen your support system? Can you gather information? Can you practice a new skill? Can you set a smaller boundary before making a larger change? Preparation transforms fear into tasks, but some fear cannot be solved in advance. The fear of being misunderstood, of beginning again, of not knowing who you will become, or of discovering that growth is slower than imagined may remain. These fears do not always mean stop. Sometimes they mean you have reached the edge of the identity that knew how to protect you. The familiar says, at least you know what happens here. The true says, yes, and that is exactly why you can no longer pretend you do not know the cost. A door becomes difficult to cross when the room behind you still knows your name. It remembers your habits, your failures, your victories, and the shape you learned to take. The open space ahead cannot yet recognize you because you have not entered it. That does not make the old room safer. It makes it familiar, and the moment you understand the difference, you begin to see why leaving also requires grief. Chapter 3. The grief of outgrowing yourself. Growth is often described as expansion, possibility, and freedom. Less often do we speak about the grief that accompanies it. Every new identity is born beside a loss. To become someone different, you must release some of the roles, dreams, explanations, and protections that once organized your life. Even when the change is necessary, the old self does not vanish without emotion. It may have carried you through years of uncertainty. It may have helped you earn love, survive instability, meet expectations, or create order. It may have been limited, but it was not meaningless. This is why transformation can feel like mourning. You may grieve the person you were before disappointment taught you caution. You may grieve a dream that once gave you direction, but no longer belongs to your future. You may grieve the time invested in a relationship, profession, belief, or plan. You may grieve the version of yourself that tried so hard to make the old life work. None of this means you should return. Missing something is not the same as being called back to it. Nostalgia is an emotion, not an instruction. When people do not understand this, they often interpret grief as evidence that the transition was wrong. They leave a familiar situation, feel the pain of separation, and assume the pain proves they made a mistake. But grief is not always regret. Grief is the mind and body adjusting to the absence of something that once held meaning. You can know a relationship needed to end and still miss the shared language. You can know a career no longer fits and still miss the competence, routine, and identity it gave you. You can know a community limited your growth and still miss the belonging. You can know a former dream is finished and still feel tenderness toward the person who believed in it. The heart does not become dishonest because it remembers beauty inside something that could not continue. One reason this grief is so difficult is that it is often invisible. Society understands certain losses. There are rituals, condolences, and language for death. But there is little ceremony for the loss of an identity. People may congratulate you for changing careers, leaving a harmful situation, or beginning again. They see opportunity. They may not see the funeral happening inside you. You are saying goodbye to familiar evidence of who you were. An old identity contains more than habits. It contains memories. It carries the voices of people who knew you at a particular age. It contains rooms, songs, routines, objects, phrases, and imagined futures. When you release it, you do not only change the present, you alter the meaning of the past. This can create a strange form of guilt. If I no longer want this, was I lying before? If I leave, does that mean the years were wasted? If I become different, am I betraying the people who helped me become who I was? The answer is not simple, but it begins with this. A truth can be sincere for one season and incomplete for the next. You may have genuinely wanted the life you built. You may have loved the person you were. You may have made the best decisions available with the understanding, resources, and needs you had at the time. Growth does not retroactively turn those decisions into fraud. A bridge is not a failure because you no longer live on it. It served by carrying you across. The problem begins when gratitude becomes obligation. You believe that because a role protected you, you must wear it forever. Because a dream gave you hope, you must continue pursuing it after it has lost meaning. Because people supported one version of you, you must remain recognizable to them. But gratitude does not require permanent residence. You can thank an old identity and still release it. Consider the identity of the strong one. Perhaps you became capable because your environment required it. You solved problems, carried burdens, remained calm, and asked for little. That identity may have protected your family or helped you survive. Others came to depend upon it. Over time, however, strength became the rule that you could never be tired, uncertain, or supported. To grow beyond that identity, you may need to admit need, receive help, or stop rescuing everyone. The change will feel like betrayal because the old role was praised. People may say you have changed as though change were evidence against you. You have changed. The question is whether the change brings you closer to truth. Another common grief is the loss of imagined time. You may look backward and calculate the years spent in a path you now want to leave. Regret begins to speak in harsh mathematics. I should have known sooner. I could have started 10 years ago. I wasted my best years. This language deepens the wound without improving the future. There may be choices you would make differently now. Responsibility matters. Reflection matters. But punishing your former self for not possessing your current awareness is not wisdom. It is cruelty disguised as insight. The person you were made decisions from the conditions of that time. Perhaps fear was stronger. Perhaps options were fewer. Perhaps you needed belonging, income, survival, or approval. Perhaps you had not yet experienced what would make the current truth visible. You can learn without condemning. A useful practice is to separate the value of a chapter from the necessity of continuing it. Ask what the old life gave you. Maybe it taught discipline, patience, boundaries, skill, compassion, discernment, or courage. Maybe it revealed what you cannot tolerate. Maybe it introduced you to people who changed you. Maybe it allowed you to support someone you love. Maybe it simply kept you alive until you were ready to choose differently. These gains do not cancel the pain, but they prevent you from reducing an entire chapter to failure. Then ask what the old identity now costs. Perhaps it asks you to remain silent, overwork, seek approval, repeat a family pattern, or deny an emerging truth. The identity may once have served you and now limit you. Both statements can be true. This is maturity, the ability to hold gratitude and release in the same hand. There is also grief for unrealized futures. Every identity carries imagined scenes. You may have pictured a home, a celebration, a title, a family structure, a legacy, or a particular kind of recognition. When the identity changes, those future images may disappear before anything replaces them. You are not only losing what happened, you are losing what you believed would happen. This is why a transition can feel empty, even when it is correct. The old future has dissolved. The new future is not yet detailed enough to comfort you. Do not rush to fill that emptiness with a new fantasy. Allow yourself to admit what has ended. A person who refuses grief often carries the old life into the new one in disguised form. They enter another relationship while still fighting the previous one. They choose a new career only to prove something to the old audience. They build a new identity entirely around rejecting the former self. That is not release. It is continuation through opposition. True release does not require hatred. You do not need to declare that everyone behind you was wrong, that every year was wasted, or that your former self was weak. Hatred keeps the old structure psychologically central. You may leave the room, but continue arranging your life around proving that the room had no power over you. The door beyond the known asks for something quieter. It asks you to say this was real, this mattered, and this is over. One way to organize this grief is to write privately to the identity you are leaving, not as a performance and not as a mystical ritual, as an act of honest meaning. Begin with 3 sentences. You protected me by... You taught me. But I can no longer continue living through. Perhaps the identity protected you by making you agreeable. It taught you sensitivity, but you can no longer live through fear of disapproval. Perhaps it protected you by making you productive. It taught you discipline, but you can no longer live as though rest makes you worthless. Perhaps it protected you by making you invisible. It helped you avoid conflict, but you can no longer live without a voice. Perhaps it protected you by making you skeptical. It prevented disappointment, but you can no longer reject every possibility before it begins. The purpose is not to erase the old self. It is to place it in history. A mature identity does not destroy its previous forms. It integrates them. The child, survivor, achiever, caregiver, rebel, believer, and doubter may all remain within you as sources of memory. But none must govern every future decision. When grief rises, allow it to move without treating it as a command to return. You may feel sadness after setting a boundary. You may feel lonely after leaving a familiar community. You may feel disoriented after releasing a title. These emotions deserve care, conversation, rest, and sometimes professional support. They do not automatically mean you chose incorrectly. Ask what you miss specifically. Do you miss the person or the feeling of being known? Do you miss the work or the certainty of competence? Do you miss the relationship or the relief of not being alone? Do you miss the dream or the approval it promised? Specific grief can be understood. Vague grief often becomes a doorway back into repetition. The old identity will sometimes appear beautiful in memory because memory edits. It removes the daily constriction and preserves moments of warmth. Do not distrust warmth. Just remember the whole picture. The room behind you may have held light. It may also have become too small. Both can be true. There comes a moment in every deep transition when you stop asking the old self for permission to continue. You thank it for its service. You mourn what cannot come with you. You carry forward what remains useful, and you place down the burden of remaining loyal to a version of yourself whose work is complete. But after grief comes a quieter challenge. The old identity has loosened. The new one is not yet strong. You are no longer fully who you were, and you do not yet know who you are becoming. You have entered the corridor between identities. Chapter 4. The corridor between identities. There is a stage of transformation that receives very little attention because it offers no dramatic image of success. It is the period after the old identity has begun to fall away and before the new one feels real. You are no longer fully who you were, but you cannot yet speak with confidence about who you are becoming. The former role feels false, yet the next role feels unearned. The old routines no longer fit, but the new routines have not become natural. You have left one room, and the next has not opened clearly enough to enter. This is the corridor between identities. It can feel like confusion, emptiness, laziness, or failure. In reality, it is often a necessary period of reorganization. The mind has lost a familiar structure. The body no longer receives the same signals. Relationships are changing. The language you use to explain yourself is becoming inaccurate. The future has not yet accumulated enough evidence to replace the past. Most people try to escape this corridor as quickly as possible. They return to the old identity because it offers immediate coherence. Or they adopt a new identity too quickly, speaking with certainty they have not earned, attaching themselves to a new group, relationship, philosophy, or goal before they have understood what they are seeking. The discomfort of not knowing becomes so intense that any label feels safer than honest incompleteness. But a rushed identity is often another costume. The corridor asks you to remain unfinished for a time. This does not mean abandoning all structure. It means allowing your sense of self to become more flexible while preserving the practical foundations that keep your life stable. You can be uncertain about your direction and still pay your bills, care for your body, fulfill essential responsibilities, and treat people with respect. You do not need a complete philosophy of your future to make breakfast, answer an important message, or take the next responsible step. During transition, the mind often interprets reduced certainty as reduced worth. You may look at people who seem established and feel as though you have fallen behind. They have titles, routines, plans, and public evidence. You have questions. But certainty and truth are not the same. A person can be highly organized inside a life that no longer belongs to them. Another can be temporarily disoriented because they have stopped pretending. The second person may look less impressive while moving closer to reality. One of the most common experiences in the corridor is the loss of momentum. Tasks that once felt automatic become difficult. You may find it harder to concentrate, make decisions, or feel enthusiasm. This can happen because the old motivational system has weakened. Perhaps you are driven by approval, fear, competition, or the need to prove yourself. When those forces lose power, there may be a period in which nothing seems to move you. Do not immediately interpret this as permanent emptiness. You may be learning to act from a different source. For years, urgency may have been your fuel. Without panic, you feel motionless. For years, praise may have guided you. Without an audience, you feel uncertain. For years, conflict may have given your life intensity. Without the battle, you feel numb. The absence of the old fuel can feel like the absence of life. It may actually be the beginning of a quieter form of motivation. This quieter motivation does not always arrive as excitement. It may appear as curiosity, relief, steadiness, or a small repeated desire to explore something. It may not demand a dramatic leap. It may ask for an hour of study, a conversation, a journal entry, a class, a walk, a boundary, or a practical experiment. The corridor teaches you to notice signals that are softer than fear. Another challenge is the pressure to explain yourself. People may ask what comes next, and you may not know. They may want a title, timeline, or decision that makes your transition easier for them to understand. You may feel ashamed to say, "I'm still learning. I'm not ready to name this. I know what has ended, but I do not yet know the final form of what follows." There is dignity in an honest, unfinished sentence. You are not required to invent certainty to make others comfortable. However, honesty should not become an excuse for indefinite paralysis. The corridor is not a permanent identity. It is a passage. Reflection must eventually produce movement. The danger is turning uncertainty into a protected space where no choice can be evaluated because nothing is ever attempted. A useful question is, what can I do now that does not require a complete answer? You may not know whether a new profession is right, but you can speak with 3 people in that field. You may not know whether a relationship can be repaired, but you can have the conversation you have avoided. You may not know where you want to live, but you can study the financial and practical realities of several options. You may not know what kind of creator you are, but you can complete one small piece of work. Movement creates information. The corridor becomes dangerous only when you wait for identity to arrive before action. In most cases, identity develops through action. You begin to trust yourself because you observe yourself learning, choosing, correcting, and continuing. Still, movement needs a stable floor. Major transitions can increase stress, and stress can distort judgment. This is why a temporary structure is valuable. Think of it as scaffolding around a building under renovation. The scaffolding is not the final architecture. It simply prevents collapse while the deeper work is being done. Your temporary structure may include a consistent sleep schedule, basic exercise, regular meals, financial tracking, limited digital exposure, time with trustworthy people, and a daily period of reflection or study. These practices may appear ordinary, but they protect your capacity to discern. When identity is uncertain, routine can hold the body while the mind reorganizes. This does not mean forcing yourself into perfect productivity. A transition may require more rest than your old pace allowed. It may involve grief, fatigue, or professional support. The goal is not to perform strength. The goal is to maintain enough stability that uncertainty does not become unnecessary chaos. Consider a person who leaves a long-term role after years of internal conflict. During the first weeks, relief arrives. Then the relief fades. Without the role, mornings feel shapeless. Former colleagues continue with their lives. The person begins to question the decision. The mind romanticizes the old routine and forgets the reasons for leaving. If this person expects immediate clarity, panic may follow. They may accept the first available replacement simply to escape the discomfort. But if they understand the corridor, they can interpret the disorientation differently. They can build a temporary rhythm, explore intentionally, and allow evidence to accumulate. The question changes from, "Who am I now?" to, "What am I learning about how I want to live?" This is a more useful question because it does not demand a finished identity. The corridor also reveals which relationships were connected to your essence and which were connected primarily to your role. Some people will remain interested in you when the title, usefulness, or familiar pattern changes. Others may withdraw. This can be painful, but it provides information. Do not turn every departure into proof that people were false. Relationships are shaped by context. Some bonds belong to a season. Their ending does not always mean they lacked value, but pay attention to who can meet you without requiring you to return to the person you were. You may also discover that some people recognize your emerging self before you do. They notice your energy change. They ask different questions. They encourage exploration without forcing a decision. These relationships can become part of the temporary structure that supports transition. The corridor requires both solitude and contact. Too much noise makes it difficult to hear what is changing. Too much isolation makes fear sound like truth. Choose a small number of grounded voices, not people who will flatter every impulse, and not people who will defend the old life at any cost. Choose those who can ask honest questions without trying to own the answer. It can also help to create a temporary answer for social situations. You do not owe everyone the full complexity of your transition. A simple sentence such as, "I am reconsidering my direction and taking time to make a responsible decision," can protect the process from unnecessary interrogation. Privacy is not deception. Some beginnings need distance from constant opinion before they are strong enough to be discussed openly. When doubt arrives, do not demand that it disappear. Doubt is natural when evidence is incomplete. Instead, ask whether the doubt contains useful information. Is it warning you about an unexamined risk? Is it asking for preparation? Or is it simply repeating the old identity's belief that uncertainty is unacceptable? Not every doubt deserves obedience. Some deserve investigation. A simple practice during this period is to keep 2 records. In one, write what the old identity still asks you to repeat. In the other, record small moments when the new direction feels more honest. These may include a conversation in which you spoke differently, an hour of work that gave you quiet energy, a boundary you maintained, or a situation in which you did not perform your old role. Over time, these moments become evidence. You do not need a complete identity to take the next honest step. You need enough awareness to avoid automatic return, enough structure to remain stable, and enough courage to let action teach you what thought alone cannot. The corridor is not empty. It is where the old instructions lose authority and the new ones are tested. Walk slowly if necessary, rest when needed, ask for help. Keep practical responsibilities visible, but do not mistake the absence of a finished map for the absence of a path. The path is forming beneath each step, and soon the mind will demand to see all of it before allowing you to continue. Chapter 5. The mind demands a map. The mind loves completed pictures. It wants to know where the road leads, how long the journey will take, what each turn will require, and whether the destination will justify the effort. It wants certainty before commitment. This desire is understandable. A map reduces danger. It helps us plan, prepare, and avoid unnecessary loss. In practical life, information matters. Research, counsel, savings, training, legal guidance, and contingency plans can protect us from preventable mistakes. But there are thresholds beyond which no amount of thought can provide complete certainty. Some knowledge exists only after movement. You cannot know whether a new form of work fits you by imagining it forever. You cannot know whether a boundary will transform a relationship until you set it. You cannot know how your identity will change after a transition while remaining entirely inside the identity that fears it. You cannot feel the ground beyond the door without placing some weight upon it. The problem begins when preparation becomes a disguise for postponement. You read another book, ask another person, watch another video, compare another option, and redesign the plan. Each action looks responsible, yet nothing changes in reality. The research does not lead toward a decision. It protects you from having to make one. This is sometimes called analysis paralysis, but the phrase does not fully capture what is happening. Beneath excessive analysis is often a hidden bargain. If I can gather enough information, perhaps I can eliminate the possibility of regret. But no meaningful decision offers that guarantee. Every path excludes other paths. Every commitment contains risk. Every beginning creates the possibility of disappointment. Even remaining where you are is a decision with consequences. The demand for a perfect map is often the demand for a future without vulnerability. Imagine standing at the entrance of a forest at night with a small lantern. The lantern illuminates only a few steps. You refuse to enter until the entire path becomes visible. You wait for the light to reach the mountain beyond the trees, the river, the bridge, and the distant valley. The lantern cannot do that. Its purpose is not to reveal the whole journey. Its purpose is to make the next few steps possible. Many people mistake limited visibility for wrong direction. They say, if this were truly meant for me, I would feel certain. If this were the correct choice, I would not be afraid. If I were ready, I would know exactly what to do. These beliefs create unnecessary shame. Clarity does not always arrive as confidence. Sometimes clarity is simply the repeated recognition that a present condition cannot continue, combined with a small direction that deserves investigation. Fear may remain because the decision matters. This is why it is important to distinguish information that can be gathered before action from information that can only be gained through experience. Before action, you can often learn about cost, timing, requirements, legal obligations, safety, market conditions, training, support, and likely challenges. You can speak with people who have walked similar paths. You can test assumptions. You can prepare financially. You can identify risks and reduce them. Through experience, you discover whether the daily reality fits your temperament, whether your interest survives difficulty, how you respond to the environment, which skills are missing, and what the transition awakens within you. No amount of planning can substitute for this second kind of knowledge. A responsible transition uses both. It does not leap blindly. It also does not demand impossible certainty. One way to move beyond the map problem is to classify decisions according to reversibility. Some choices are easy to adjust. You can take a short course, volunteer, test a service, change a routine, schedule a conversation, create a small project, or spend a week in a new environment. These actions produce information without requiring total commitment. Other choices are difficult to reverse. Ending a legal partnership, selling essential property, taking on large debt, relocating dependents, or leaving a secure position without preparation may carry serious consequences. These deserve slower evaluation and, where appropriate, professional guidance. Fear treats every step as irreversible. Wisdom separates experiments from commitments. Consider someone who dreams of becoming a writer, but refuses to begin until they know whether a book will sell. The mind demands a map from the first page to public success. It asks questions no beginner can answer. Will the work matter? Will people care? Is this the right genre? Could the time be better spent elsewhere? The person keeps planning and never writes enough to discover what kind of writer they are. A more honest step is smaller. Write consistently for 30 days, complete one essay, share it with a thoughtful reader. Observe whether the work continues to call you after the novelty fades. The experiment does not promise a career, it creates evidence. The same principle applies to many transitions. You do not have to decide today whether a new field will define the rest of your life. You can decide whether it deserves one serious conversation. You do not have to know whether a relationship can be repaired forever. You can decide whether both people are willing to participate in one honest process. You do not have to know who you will become after setting a boundary. You can decide whether the current violation can continue. The mind demands total answers because total answers delay exposure. Small actions remove that protection. Another form of map seeking is the search for external permission. You ask many people what you should do, not because you value perspective, but because you want someone else to become responsible for the outcome. If the choice succeeds, you will feel approved. If it fails, you can say you followed advice. Counsel is valuable. Ownership is necessary. The right advisor helps you see consequences, assumptions, and blind spots. They do not take possession of your life. Be cautious with anyone who claims certainty about a decision they will not have to live. Also, be cautious with voices that turn uncertainty into mystical proof. A coincidence, dream, phrase, or emotional moment may hold personal meaning. It should not replace practical evaluation. The unknown does not become sacred by becoming irresponsible. A grounded transition asks both spiritual and practical questions. What feels honest? What is supported by evidence? What responsibilities must be protected? What risks can be reduced? What uncertainty must be accepted? There is dignity in admitting that you do not know, but there is also danger in using not knowing as permanent shelter. At some point, the map has given everything it can. More analysis produces no new clarity. You are circling the same questions with different words. This is the moment to ask whether one small action could teach more than another month of thought. A helpful framework contains 3 questions. What can I learn before acting? What can only be learned through experience? What risk must be reduced before I proceed? Write the answers plainly. Separate facts from fears. Separate preparation from avoidance. Then identify the smallest meaningful action that would create real information. The action should be visible. It should change something outside your mind, even if only slightly. Send the message. Schedule the appointment. Create the budget. Visit the place. Complete the application. Begin the course. Draft the proposal. Have the conversation. Before acting, define what would make the experiment useful, even if the desired outcome does not occur. A conversation may be useful because it clarifies the other person's willingness. An application may be useful because it reveals a missing qualification. A trial project may be useful because it exposes whether your interest survives routine. When success is defined only as immediate reward, valuable information is mistaken for failure. A good experiment is designed to teach. Also decide in advance when you will review the result. Do not evaluate a new direction every hour according to mood. Give the action enough time to produce evidence, then examine it honestly. This protects you from abandoning too quickly and from continuing blindly. Do not confuse a dramatic act with a meaningful act. The first honest step may be quiet. As you move, resist the temptation to demand immediate confirmation. New directions often feel awkward before they feel right. Skills are weak, routines are unfamiliar, and the old identity may produce doubt simply because it is losing control. Evaluate the action over time. Ask what it teaches, not whether it instantly proves destiny. If this journey is helping you understand a transition that once felt like confusion or failure, take a quiet moment to subscribe. Let it become a reminder that uncertainty does not always mean you are lost. Sometimes it means you are moving beyond the limits of what your former life could explain. The future will not reveal itself all at once. It reveals enough to keep an honest traveler moving. There is another reason a complete map is impossible. You will change along the way. The person choosing at the beginning is not the person who will evaluate the path later. Experience alters capacity, values, relationships, and vision. A map drawn entirely from the old identity cannot fully predict the needs of the new one. This is not a flaw in planning. It is the nature of becoming. The door beyond the known does not ask you to abandon intelligence. It asks you to use intelligence without making certainty an idol. Prepare what can be prepared. Reduce what can be reduced. Seek help where expertise matters. Protect those who depend upon you. Then recognize the point at which preparation has become fear wearing responsible clothing. The lantern will not show the entire forest. When the mind protests that the step is too small, remember that the purpose of a beginning is not to impress. It is to establish contact with reality. A small action repeated with attention can reveal more than a grand plan protected from experience. It will show the next step, and sometimes that is the only map a living path can offer. But before you take that step, you must face another danger. Not every door leads forward. Some doors are only escape disguised as transformation. Chapter 6. The false door of escape. Not every desire to leave is a call toward growth. Sometimes the unknown attracts us because we have turned it into a fantasy. We imagine that another city, another relationship, another profession, another community, or another version of ourselves will finally remove the discomfort we have refused to understand. The door looks like freedom because we have projected everything painful onto the room behind us. This is the false door of escape. It opens outward, but the pattern walks through with us. A person may leave a job because they feel unseen, then enter another workplace carrying the same inability to communicate needs, set boundaries, or tolerate feedback. They may leave a relationship because intimacy feels constricting, then repeat the same distance with someone new. They may change cities, spiritual communities, business models, or social circles while preserving the identity that creates the same conflict in each place. The environment matters. Some environments are genuinely harmful, exploitative, unsafe, or incompatible with growth. Leaving them can be necessary. But an external change does not automatically transform the internal pattern that developed within them. When safety is involved, discernment should not become an excuse to remain exposed. A person facing violence, coercive control, stalking, or serious threats may need specialized support, confidential planning, and immediate protection. The question, "What is my pattern?" must never be used to transfer responsibility away from someone else's abusive behavior. Inner work can support recovery, but it does not make abuse acceptable or require private endurance. In less dangerous situations, however, the same honesty still matters. You can acknowledge another person's harmful behavior while examining why you tolerated it, minimized it, or repeatedly returned. This examination is not blame. It is preparation for a safer future. This is why discernment must ask two questions at once. What in this situation truly needs to end? And what within me will require attention wherever I go? Escape becomes especially attractive after humiliation, rejection, conflict, or failure. Emotion creates urgency. The mind says, "Leave now, prove them wrong, start over somewhere no one knows you, destroy the old plan before it can reject you again." There are moments when immediate departure is necessary for safety. If there is violence, abuse, coercion, or serious danger, protection takes priority, and outside help may be essential. But many life decisions are not emergencies, even when the emotions surrounding them feel intense. A permanent decision made to end a temporary feeling can create a new form of captivity. Imagine two doors standing side by side. Both lead away from the current room. One opens toward growth. The other opens toward repetition. From the outside, they look identical. Both may involve change, risk, and relief. The difference is not in the movement itself. It is in the consciousness, preparation, and responsibility carried through the threshold. The door of growth asks you to become more honest, capable, and responsible. The door of escape asks only that you stop feeling what you feel now. The door of growth may be frightening, but it contains a meaningful direction. The door of escape is driven mainly by the desire for immediate relief. The door of growth requires you to examine your contribution to the current situation. The door of escape allows you to preserve a story in which every problem belongs entirely to someone or somewhere else. This does not mean blaming yourself for harm done to you. Responsibility is not the same as fault. You can be mistreated without causing the mistreatment. You can encounter injustice, discrimination, betrayal, or structural barriers that are not products of your mindset. Yet even then, healing and future protection may require you to understand your responses, vulnerabilities, resources, and boundaries. Responsibility asks, what is mine to address now? One sign of the false door is romanticization. The new path exists mainly as an image. You imagine freedom without routine, work without frustration, love without conflict, creativity without discipline, or a community without human imperfection. The fantasy contains rewards but no ordinary days. Every real path has ordinary days. The new profession will include administration, repetition, criticism, and uncertainty. The new relationship will include misunderstanding and negotiation. The new city will include expenses, loneliness, weather, traffic, and bureaucracy. The new identity will still wake in the same body with the same history. A direction does not become wrong because it contains difficulty, but a direction built entirely upon fantasy may collapse when reality arrives. Another sign is the refusal to prepare. You call planning fear. You call questions negativity. You insist that faith requires you to ignore finances, responsibilities, skill gaps, legal consequences, or the needs of people who depend upon you. This is not courage. It is often avoidance wearing spiritual language. A meaningful transition can include faith, intuition, and inner conviction. It should also include reality. If you are leaving a job, what will support you during the transition? If you are ending a partnership, what legal, financial, emotional, or housing realities need attention? If you are moving, what does the new environment actually require? If you are starting a business, what value will you offer? What skills are needed and how will risk be managed? Practical questions do not insult the soul. They give the soul a structure in which to act. The false door also appears when we leave repeatedly at the same point in every process. A new beginning excites us. Then routine arrives. Feedback becomes uncomfortable. Progress slows. The identity no longer receives immediate validation. We interpret this normal stage as proof that the path is wrong and move toward another beginning. Beginnings become an addiction. We do not want transformation. We want the emotional intensity of possibility before commitment asks us to change. To identify this pattern, look backward. Where do you usually leave? At the first criticism, when success is not immediate, when closeness requires vulnerability, when responsibility becomes visible, when someone stops admiring the version of you presented at the beginning. Repeated timing contains information. Sometimes the honest door is not the one that allows you to leave. It is the one that asks you to remain long enough to learn what avoidance has prevented you from learning. This can be difficult because our culture often celebrates departure as bravery and staying as fear. Reality is more complex. It takes courage to leave what is finished. It also takes courage to repair what is damaged but still alive. It takes courage to admit that the environment is not the only source of the problem. The key is not movement. The key is truth. Before a major change, ask whether you are moving towards something meaningful or only away from discomfort. Moving away is not always wrong. Escaping danger is wise. Leaving violation is necessary. But when no clear danger exists, a direction defined only by rejection may remain psychologically tied to what it opposes. If your new career exists mainly to prove your former colleagues wrong, the old workplace still governs you. If your new relationship exists mainly to make someone jealous, the old relationship remains central. If your new identity is built entirely around rejecting your family, the family still provides the blueprint. Freedom requires a direction larger than resistance. Ask what the new path serves. Does it support values you can name? Does it create room for contribution, integrity, learning, health, or honest relationship? Are you willing to accept the ordinary responsibilities that come with it? Can you describe not only what you are leaving, but what you are prepared to practice? Then examine what pattern may follow you. If you avoid difficult conversations, how will you practice them before or after the move? If you overspend under stress, what structure will protect you in a new financial season? If you seek approval, How will you respond when the new path is not immediately understood? If you abandon work when it becomes repetitive, how will you distinguish boredom from completion? A door becomes real when you prepare to meet yourself on the other side. One practical evaluation is to delay an emotionally charged decision long enough for the first wave to settle, provided safety is not at risk. Sleep. Write the facts. Speak with someone grounded. Review consequences. Notice whether the desire remains after the need for immediate relief decreases. An authentic transition often becomes clearer when emotion settles. An escape fantasy often loses some of its power. But do not use endless delay to avoid a truth that has already survived months or years of reflection. Time can clarify, and time can also become another hiding place. The question is whether the delay is producing information or merely repeating fear. Ask yourself 5 questions. Am I moving towards something meaningful, or am I only trying to stop feeling discomfort? Have I addressed what is within my responsibility in the current situation? What pattern might follow me through this door? What practical preparation does this transition require? Would I still consider this change if no one were watching, praising, envying, or regretting my departure? Answer without performance. The door beyond the known is not a portal that removes consequence. It is a threshold into a different set of consequences. Growth does not mean choosing a life without difficulty. It means choosing difficulty that belongs to a more honest direction. You may discover that the door you wanted to cross was false. This is not failure. Discernment has protected you. You can remain, repair, learn, or choose another path with greater clarity. You may also discover that the desire remains after fantasy is removed, responsibility is faced, and risk is examined. The door still stands. The old chapter is still complete. The new direction still asks for a step. At that point, restraint has completed its work. You are no longer running from a feeling. You are responding to a truth that remained after the feeling settled, the facts were examined, and your own responsibility was faced. Then, the challenge changes. It is no longer whether you should escape. It is whether you are willing to pay the price of not returning to a life you already know you have outgrown. Chapter 7. The price of returning. The first time you step away from an old life, fear can make the past look merciful. The room behind you appears warmer from the corridor. The arguments seem smaller. The compromises feel manageable. The identity you struggled to carry suddenly seems easier than the uncertainty ahead. You remember the familiar comforts and forget the slow constriction that led you to the door, so you return. The return brings immediate relief. The nervous system recognizes the old pattern. The questions quiet down. You know what is expected. You can explain yourself again. People may welcome you with approval, and that approval feels like evidence that the decision to leave was unnecessary. For a time, everything appears restored. Then the walls begin to move inward again. Returning is not always a mistake. Sometimes distance reveals value. A relationship can be repaired, a profession can be redesigned, a community can change. A person may discover that the problem was not the path itself, but the way they were walking it. Second attempts can be wise when new information, behavior, boundaries, or conditions genuinely alter the structure. But there is a difference between returning with new awareness and returning because fear became louder than truth. The second return often costs more than the first period of staying. Once you have seen the door, you can no longer fully believe there is no alternative. The old life may remain familiar, but it loses innocence. You know what you are postponing. This creates a subtle erosion of self-trust. Every time you recognize a truth and then abandon it without examination, your inner voice becomes easier to ignore. You learn that your own boundaries are temporary. You learn that fear can reverse your decisions. You learn that discomfort only needs to become intense enough and you will negotiate away what mattered. Self-trust is not built by never changing your mind. Wisdom revises decisions when evidence changes. Self-trust is built by knowing that your choices will be examined honestly rather than surrendered automatically. If you return, ask why. Did new evidence appear? Did the other person or system demonstrate real change? Did you discover a responsibility you had avoided? Did practical conditions require a temporary return while you prepare more carefully? Or did loneliness, guilt, judgment, financial fear, or uncertainty become unbearable? The answer matters because a temporary retreat can become part of a responsible transition. A fearful reversal can become a repeating cycle. Consider the person who leaves a relationship after years of the same unresolved pattern. Within days, silence becomes painful. The person misses companionship, routine, shared memories, and the relief of being known. The former partner promises change. The return happens before any structure for change exists. For several weeks, hope feels real. Then the old pattern reappears because nothing underneath it changed. The problem was not the return itself. The problem was confusing emotional relief with evidence. Real change leaves traces. It appears in behavior, accountability, consistency, support, and time. It is not proven by intensity, apology, or fear of loss alone. The same is true in work. A person resigns from a role, panics, and accepts an offer to return under slightly improved conditions. The salary changes, but the central conflict remains. The individual feels grateful for another chance and therefore becomes even less willing to speak honestly. The return strengthens the very structure they intended to leave. Again, the question is not whether returning is forbidden. The question is what has actually changed. A useful distinction is between returning to complete and returning to disappear. You may return to finish a project, stabilize finances, care for someone, repair harm, or prepare more responsibly. These decisions can be honorable. They have a defined purpose and a visible boundary. Returning to disappear means placing the emerging self back inside the old role so the uncertainty will stop. There is no plan. There is only relief. Relief is real, but it is not always guidance. Each return also increases the social power of the old identity. People learn that resistance will bring you back into position. If you set a boundary and repeatedly abandon it, others may stop taking it seriously. If you announce change and reverse it every time approval is withdrawn, the external world learns where your authority ends. This is not a reason for shame. It is a reason for clarity. You can rebuild authority through smaller, more sustainable commitments. Instead of making dramatic declarations, create practical conditions. Instead of saying, "I will never return," say, "These are the changes required before I reconsider." Instead of promising immediate departure without resources, create a timeline, budget, support network, and first action. A door is easier to cross when the decision is supported by structure. Another cost of repeated return is the shrinking of imagination. Each failed attempt becomes evidence used against the future. You say, "I tried to leave before and could not. I always go back. Maybe this is simply who I am." This conclusion is too final. A previous return proves that the preparation, support, timing, or internal readiness was insufficient then. It does not prove that change is impossible now. Study the return as information. What became unbearable? What resource was missing? Which relationship pulled you back? What practical difficulty had not been planned for? What belief made the old life feel safer? What part of the new direction was still fantasy? This analysis turns regret into instruction. The price of staying can also be measured. Fear tends to calculate only the cost of leaving. It lists lost income, uncertainty, judgment, effort, loneliness, and possible failure. It rarely calculates the cost of another year unchanged. That cost may include health, time, opportunity, creative energy, dignity, relationships, financial growth, or the repeated abandonment of values. Make the invisible cost visible. What will staying cost emotionally if nothing changes? What will it cost financially? What will it cost physically? What will it cost your relationships? What opportunity may close? What will it teach you about the value of your own word? Do not exaggerate. Do not create fear to force a decision. Use realistic evidence. The purpose is to compare both paths honestly. Sometimes the cost of leaving is high and the cost of staying is higher. Sometimes the cost of leaving is high and the cost of staying is lower because the situation can be repaired. Clarity comes from refusing to calculate only one side. There may also be a deeper reason you return. The new life does not recognize you yet. In the old life, you may be competent. People know what you offer. Your history gives you weight. In the new direction, you are a beginner. The loss of status can feel like loss of self. This is why humility is essential. You must be willing to exchange familiar importance for unfamiliar learning. A person may return to a prestigious but empty role because the new path makes them ordinary. They would rather be admired in the wrong room than unknown in the right one. The price of that return is the future self who never develops. If you have returned before, do not use this chapter to condemn yourself. Fear is powerful. Practical realities matter. Change often requires more than a single act of courage. It may require multiple attempts, better planning, stronger support, and deeper healing. The important question is what you do with what the return taught you. You can return and remain asleep. Or you can return temporarily, study the structure, gather what is needed, and prepare to leave differently. One practice is to write a return plan before the next attempt. Identify what you will do when loneliness arrives, when money becomes tight, when others criticize, when the new path feels slow, and when the old life begins to look beautiful in memory. Decide who you will call, what evidence you will review, and which actions will keep the transition moving. Include the hours when you are most vulnerable. Some people return late at night after conflict, during financial panic, or after seeing others appear successful. Anticipate these moments. Remove easy access to impulsive decisions where appropriate. Place supportive contact, written reasons, and practical options within reach. Courage is not only the strength of the moment, it is the wisdom to arrange the environment before the moment arrives. Rebuilding self-trust may begin with a smaller promise than the one you broke. Perhaps you are not ready to complete the entire transition this month. You may be ready to save a defined amount, attend every appointment, maintain one boundary, or stop making promises to the old situation that contradict your plan. Each fulfilled commitment teaches your mind that your word is becoming reliable again. Do not wait until fear is at full volume to invent support. Another practice is to create criteria for reconsideration. If you are leaving a role, relationship, or arrangement, define what real change would look like. Not promises, not pressure. Observable conditions. Invite one grounded person to know those conditions. Fear becomes persuasive when it argues in isolation. A trustworthy witness can remind you of what you decided while clear, without controlling the decision for you. Choose someone who respects both safety and truth, not someone invested in keeping you in either the old life or the new one. Their role is not to command. It is to help you remember the evidence when emotion narrows your view. This prevents emotion from rewriting the decision every time discomfort appears. There is a moment when the person who returned looks around and realizes that the room feels smaller than before. This is painful, but it is also revealing. The temporary relief cannot restore ignorance. You have seen another possibility. The old life may still hold love, skill, memory, and security, but now you understand that familiarity is not enough. The price of returning is not simply delay. It is the gradual training of yourself to distrust your own awakening. That price can still be interrupted. You can examine the return without shame, prepare what was missing, and choose again. Then one day the door opens, fear speaks, and you do not interpret fear as a command. Before that moment arrives, forgive the part of you that returned. It was trying to recover certainty with the tools it possessed. Forgiveness does not excuse repetition. It removes the shame that makes clear preparation harder. You can honor the lesson without making another retreat inevitable. You take the first step without proof. Chapter 8. The first step without proof. There is a moment when reflection has done everything it can. You have examined the old life. You have questioned your motives. You have considered risk, responsibility, grief, and the possibility of escape. You have gathered information, spoken with people you trust, and waited long enough to see whether the desire would disappear. It remains. The door is still there. At this point, the mind often asks for one final thing, proof that the step will work. It wants a guarantee that the application will be accepted, the conversation will be understood, the business will survive, the move will succeed, the relationship will heal, the audience will respond, or the new identity will feel natural. It wants evidence from a future that has not yet been created, That evidence cannot exist before the step. The first action in a real transition is often taken without proof, not without thought, not without preparation, not without responsibility, without proof. This distinction matters because reckless action and courageous action can look similar from a distance. Both move before certainty arrives, but reckless action ignores information. Courageous action accepts that information has limits. The first step should be grounded enough to respect reality and small enough to teach. Imagine crossing a river where no finished bridge exists. On the opposite bank, you can see a direction that matters. Near your feet are materials for one section of the bridge. You cannot build the entire structure from where you stand, because the angle, current, and distance will become clearer only as you move. You build the first section. It does not prove that the crossing will be easy. It gives you a place from which to build the next section. This is how many lives change. The first step may be a conversation in which you finally speak honestly. It may be opening a separate savings account, enrolling in a course, requesting professional advice, ending a recurring obligation, creating a portfolio, visiting a new place, applying for a position, scheduling therapy, or asking someone to respect a boundary. The step matters because it converts an internal possibility into external evidence. Until action occurs, the new life exists mainly as imagination. Action gives it weight. This is why endless affirmations can become another form of delay. You may repeat that you are ready, capable, aligned, or destined. These statements can support courage, but they cannot replace behavior. The door responds to movement, not declaration. A visible action changes your relationship with yourself. You become someone who has begun. That identity may be fragile. The action may be small, but it creates a fact that fear cannot completely erase. One reason people avoid the first step is that they imagine it must be dramatic. They believe courage means resigning immediately, moving across the world, investing everything, or making a public announcement. Large gestures can create emotional intensity, but intensity is not the same as transformation. The most effective first step is often quieter. A woman who wants to leave a financially dependent situation may begin by learning the true cost of living independently. A man who wants to change careers may complete one certification while still employed. A person who needs to establish a boundary may first write the exact sentence and practice saying it calmly. A creator may finish one piece instead of announcing an entire future project. Small does not mean insignificant. A step is significant when it produces information, increases capacity, reduces risk, or strengthens integrity. The first step also exposes fantasy. Once you act, the new direction becomes real enough to resist you. You encounter boredom, difficulty, logistics, feedback, and limits. This is valuable. A fantasy cannot teach you whether the path fits. Reality can. Do not interpret early difficulty as immediate proof that the direction is wrong. Beginners are inefficient. New systems feel awkward. Identity resists unfamiliar behavior. Evaluate the nature of the difficulty. Is this the ordinary friction of learning? Is it revealing a skill gap you can address? Is it exposing a risk you underestimated? Or is it showing that the direction itself conflicts with your values and responsibilities? Movement gives you better questions. Another reason the first step feels dangerous is that it creates consequence. As long as the new life remains private, you can imagine it without being evaluated. Once you act, you can fail. Someone can say no. The work can be criticized. The conversation can become uncomfortable. The fantasy of potential becomes the reality of performance. Potential is protected by inaction. Capacity is built through exposure. This is why the first rejection can feel larger than it is. You send one application, receive silence, and the old identity says, "See, the door was never meant for you." You share one piece of work, receive little response, and decide the path is false. You establish one boundary, encounter resistance, and conclude that change is impossible. One result is not a verdict on an entire life. Treat early outcomes as data. Ask what they reveal about preparation, communication, timing, fit, skill, and persistence. Adjust. The first step is not sacred because it must succeed. It is sacred because it begins the process through which reality can answer you. A grounded transition follows a simple rhythm: clarify, reduce risk, take one step, observe, adjust, then repeat. This rhythm protects you from two extremes. One is paralysis, in which you wait for impossible certainty. The other is blind commitment, in which you refuse to revise because admitting new information feels like failure. A living path requires both courage and correction. There is also a spiritual temptation to expect the universe to reward the first step immediately. You act, then search for signs that the choice has been approved. You interpret smoothness as alignment and difficulty as rejection. Life is not always that simple. A meaningful direction can contain obstacles. A harmful direction can begin with excitement. External events are influenced by many factors beyond personal intention. The first step does not command reality. It changes your participation in reality. That is enough. You do not need to believe that every event is arranged for you. You need to become attentive enough to learn from what occurs. Consider someone who has wanted to return to education for years. The person waits for the perfect program, perfect finances, perfect confidence, and perfect time. None arrive together. Eventually, they choose one responsible action: schedule a conversation with an advisor and gather accurate information. That conversation does not guarantee enrollment. It reveals options, costs, prerequisites, and timelines. The person creates a budget, takes one evening class, and discovers both excitement and difficulty. The path becomes less romantic and more real. This is progress. Proof did not come before movement. Evidence came through movement. Your first step may reveal that the original plan needs to change. Perhaps the field is different from what you imagined. Perhaps the timing is wrong. Perhaps you need more support. This does not make the step wasted. It has saved you from building an entire future upon an untested assumption. A step can be successful because it tells you no. The unknown becomes dangerous when we fill it only with hope or only with fear. Action replaces projection with information. Choose one direction that has survived honest examination. Then identify a step you can take within the next 24 hours or 7 days, depending on its seriousness. The step should be specific enough that another person could verify whether it happened. Not, I will think about changing, but I will schedule the consultation. Not, I will become more confident, but I will submit the work before Friday. Not, I will protect my energy, but I will decline the obligation that repeatedly violates my limit. Not, I will prepare financially, but I will calculate the transition cost and transfer the first amount into savings. Do not announce the step merely to receive the emotional reward of being seen as courageous. Protect it until action has given it substance. Share with people whose support improves accountability, safety, or wisdom. Then take the step before your mind turns it into another theory. Afterward, record what happened. What did fear predict? What occurred in reality? What information appeared? What requires adjustment? What became easier simply because the action was no longer imaginary? Then protect the hours after action. The mind may produce what could be called an emotional recoil. After sending the message or taking the step, you may feel exposed and suddenly want to undo it. You may check repeatedly for a response, explain more than necessary, apologize for a reasonable boundary, or convince yourself that the action was foolish. This reaction does not automatically mean the step was wrong. It may be the old identity, attempting to restore familiar control. Create a waiting period before reversing a considered action, unless new information reveals genuine danger. Breathe, continue your routine, and allow the nervous system to settle. A step deserves to be evaluated from more than the first wave of vulnerability. When a response arrives, meet it as information. Approval is welcome, but it is not the only valid outcome. Resistance may reveal where the old structure depended upon your silence. Silence may reveal that another route is needed. A no may direct you toward preparation. The world does not owe immediate confirmation, but every response can deepen discernment. This record becomes evidence for self-trust. Confidence is often described as a feeling that permits action. More often, confidence is the memory of actions taken, while the feeling was incomplete. You may still be afraid after the first step. The door may not open widely, but you will no longer be standing in exactly the same place. The unknown has begun to answer, and as you continue, another challenge appears. You have acted in a new direction, but the new identity still feels borrowed. The first step does not complete the crossing. It changes your position. From there, the work becomes less about proving that the door was correct, and more about practicing the person capable of living beyond it. You must learn to become before you feel ready. Chapter 9. Becoming before you feel ready. The first time you act from a new identity, it rarely feels natural. Your voice may shake when you set the boundary. Your work may feel unworthy when you submit it. Your new routine may feel like an imitation. You may enter a room and believe everyone can see that you do not fully belong there. This is not always evidence that the new direction is false. It may be evidence that your history has not yet caught up with your decision. The old identity feels authentic because it has been repeated. You have practiced its posture, language, expectations, and limits for years. The body recognizes it. Other people reinforce it. Memories support it. Even when it causes pain, it feels like you because it is familiar. The new identity has little evidence. It is composed of intention, a few actions, and a possibility that has not yet become stable. Of course, it feels less real. Many people wait for the feeling of readiness before they allow themselves to practice the new life. They believe confidence should arrive first, followed by action. But identity usually develops in the opposite order. You act with incomplete confidence. The action produces evidence. Repeated evidence changes self-perception. Self-perception makes the next action more natural. Becoming is a process of accumulation. Consider a person who has spent years remaining silent in meetings. They decide to contribute. The first time, the heart races. The sentence feels too simple. After speaking, the mind reviews every word and imagines judgment. If the person interprets discomfort as inauthenticity, they retreat. They say, "I am not confident. That is not who I am." But confidence was never going to arrive as permission from outside the behavior. It is built through tolerating the discomfort of the first attempts. The next time the person speaks again, not perfectly, not loudly, just enough to create another piece of evidence. Eventually, speaking no longer feels like a violation of identity. It becomes part of identity. This does not mean pretending to be someone you are not. There is a difference between practice and performance. Performance is built mainly for an audience. It asks, how can I appear transformed? Practice is built for capacity. It asks, what behavior would make this value more real? Performance seeks immediate recognition. Practice accepts awkward repetition. Performance creates a rigid image that must be defended. Practice allows correction. When the new identity feels borrowed, define it through actions rather than adjectives. Words like confident, successful, spiritual, disciplined, independent, or creative can become vague costumes. They sound powerful but provide little instruction. Translate them into behavior. Instead of saying, "I want to be confident," say, "I will speak once when I would normally remain silent." Instead of saying, "I want to be disciplined," say, "I will protect 20 minutes each morning for the work I claim matters." Instead of saying, "I want to be independent," say, "I will understand my finances and make one decision without seeking unnecessary approval." Instead of saying, "I want to be creative," say, "I will complete and share one piece each week." Behavior gives identity a body. The feeling of being an imposter often appears during this stage. You may believe that because the new action is deliberate rather than automatic, it is false. But every skill begins as conscious effort. A musician does not wait to feel like a musician before practicing. A leader does not wait to feel entirely certain before making a responsible decision. A person learning boundaries does not wait until saying no feels effortless. Deliberate does not mean dishonest. It may mean unpracticed. However, discomfort should not be ignored completely. Sometimes it reveals that you are adopting an identity for approval. Perhaps the new path looks impressive, but does not reflect your values. Perhaps you are imitating a public image instead of discovering your own way of living. Perhaps the environment requires behavior that violates your integrity. Ask what kind of discomfort you are experiencing. Is this the discomfort of learning? Is it the fear of being seen? Is it the loss of familiar approval, or is it a deeper conflict with values? The discomfort of learning tends to decrease with skill and evidence. The discomfort of value violation often becomes more persistent as you understand the reality more clearly. This is why the new identity should remain flexible. You are not replacing one prison with another. You do not need to declare, "This is who I am now," and defend the statement against all future information. A living identity can revise. You may enter a new profession and discover a different role within it fits better. You may begin a relationship and learn that your needs are not what you assumed. You may establish independence and later choose interdependence from strength rather than fear. You may embrace a belief and later refine it. The goal is not to become impossible to change. The goal is to become capable of changing without losing integrity. Another challenge arises when people from the old life respond to your new behavior. Some will be supportive. Others will interpret your change as rejection. They may remind you who you used to be, question your motives, or test whether the new boundary is real. This can create intense self-doubt because identity is social. We learn who we are partly through how others respond. When the mirrors reflect an old version, it takes courage to continue practicing the new one. Do not assume everyone who resists is malicious. Your change may require adjustment from them. A person accustomed to your availability may need time to understand a limit. A family member may fear losing connection. A colleague may not know how to relate to your new direction. You can communicate with patience without surrendering the change. Explain what is necessary. Avoid turning the transformation into a courtroom in which everyone must approve your evidence. Let consistency speak. The new identity becomes credible through repetition, not argument. A single boundary may be dismissed. A boundary maintained calmly over time reorganizes the relationship. A single day of work may look like enthusiasm. Months of work create a pattern. A single honest conversation may surprise people. A life of greater honesty changes expectation. This is why small repeated acts matter more than dramatic declarations. There will be days when you return to old behavior. You may over-explain, procrastinate, seek approval, avoid risk, or retreat from the new direction. Do not turn one regression into proof that the identity is false. A pattern is not undone by a single imperfect day, and a new pattern is not destroyed by one return. Review what happened. Fatigue, stress, environment, fear, and lack of preparation may have influenced the behavior. Adjust the system, repair where necessary, then practice again. Shame keeps the old identity central. Reflection supports the new one. One practical method is to create evidence intentionally. Choose 3 behaviors that belong to the direction you are building. Keep them small enough to repeat and meaningful enough to matter. Then examine the environment around those behaviors. Identity is not sustained by willpower alone. A new practice becomes more likely when time, tools, people, and spaces support it. Place the book where you study. Schedule the hour you intend to protect. Reduce contact with the stimulus that repeatedly pulls you backward. Ask one trustworthy person to expect the work you promise to complete. This is not weakness, it is architecture. The old identity was supported by an environment that made its behavior easy and familiar. The new identity deserves conditions in which it can survive long enough to become strong. Perhaps you are becoming someone who protects creative work. Your behaviors are 1 protected hour, 1 completed piece each week, and 1 monthly review. Perhaps you are becoming someone who lives with stronger boundaries. Your behaviors are pausing before agreement, giving concise answers, and following through on stated consequences. Perhaps you are becoming someone who handles money responsibly. Your behaviors are tracking spending, saving automatically, and reviewing decisions before emotional purchases. These actions are not the entire identity. They are bricks. The mind begins to believe what your behavior repeatedly demonstrates. Becoming also requires accepting beginner status. The old life may have made you skilled. The new life may make you clumsy. You may compare your beginning with someone else's middle and conclude that you do not belong. Do not confuse lack of experience with lack of potential. The apprentice does not become a master by first feeling like one. The apprentice becomes through practice, feedback, humility, and time. There is freedom in allowing yourself to be seen learning. You do not have to protect an image of immediate competence. You can ask questions. You can make corrections. You can admit what you do not know. This honesty prevents the new identity from becoming another performance. At the end of each day, ask not whether you felt ready, but whether you practiced one action that belonged to the life you are entering. Keep the review brief and concrete. Identity work becomes distorted when every moment is analyzed until it loses life. Record one action that strengthened the new direction, one situation that awakened the old pattern, and one adjustment for tomorrow. This turns reflection into guidance rather than self-surveillance. The purpose is to notice construction, not to demand perfection. What did you do that the old identity would have avoided? What did you tolerate without returning? What did you learn? What needs to be repeated tomorrow? Over time, the answer changes. At first you say, I am trying to become someone who does this. Then you say, I have been practicing this. Eventually you say, this is how I live. The identity becomes natural not because fear disappeared, but because evidence accumulated. You do not cross the door as the finished person. You cross as the apprentice of your own future. And one day, after enough honest steps, you look behind you and realize the old room is no longer where you live. Do not be surprised if peace feels unfamiliar when it first arrives. The old identity may have associated intensity with meaning and struggle with progress. A quieter life can initially feel empty simply because your system has not learned to recognize steadiness as safety. Let calm become evidence too. The door has begun to close. Chapter 10. When the door closes behind you, every transition contains a point at which the old life stops being a place you are leaving and becomes a place you have left. This moment may not arrive with drama. There may be no ceremony, no final conversation, and no visible line on the ground. You simply notice that the old identity no longer organizes your decisions. The room behind you still exists in memory, but you no longer wake each morning negotiating whether to return. The door has begun to close. For many people, this creates a new fear. While the door remained open, the unknown felt less dangerous because retreat was always available. You could explore the new direction while preserving an emotional residence in the past. You compared every difficulty with the old comfort. You kept certain relationships, habits, explanations, or fantasies alive as insurance. Closing the door means accepting that freedom includes loss. Every real choice excludes other possibilities. To choose one path is to stop living several imagined lives. To commit to a new direction is to release the idea that you can preserve every former identity without cost. This is why people sometimes sabotage a successful transition near the moment of integration. The new life is becoming real and reality requires responsibility. The old life can no longer be blamed. The future is no longer a fantasy. You must build routines, relationships, skills, and structures that allow the change to survive. Crossing the door was courageous. Living beyond it requires discipline. The first task is to stop idealizing the room behind you. Memory becomes selective when the new life is difficult. It highlights familiar pleasures and removes familiar pain. You remember the salary, but forget the daily dread. You remember companionship, but forget the repeated violation. You remember status, but forget how much of yourself was sacrificed to maintain it. Do not respond by turning the past into an enemy. Keep a complete memory. The old life contained value. It also contained the conditions that made departure necessary. Both belong in the record. One practical way to preserve perspective is to write why you crossed. Record the patterns, costs, attempts at repair, and truths that led to the decision. Do this when clarity is present, not only when doubt arrives. Later, if nostalgia begins rewriting history, you can return to evidence rather than emotion alone. The second task is to accept that some people will continue relating to the former version of you. They may expect old availability, old silence, old ambition, old beliefs, or old dependence. They may use your past as evidence that the change is temporary. You do not need to convince them through argument. Let the new pattern become visible through consistency. If you have changed your boundaries, maintain them without unnecessary hostility. If you have changed direction, continue building before demanding recognition. If you have changed values, embody them in choices. People may understand slowly, incompletely, or not at all. Your transformation does not become unreal because someone refuses to update their image of you. At the same time, remain humble. Not every challenge to your new identity is an attack. Some feedback may reveal blind spots. Some people may see impulsiveness where you see courage. Listen carefully. A closed door should not become a closed mind. The goal is not to defend the new self with the same rigidity that imprisoned the old one. Integration requires a stable structure. Freedom without structure can collapse into confusion. The new life needs routines that support it, relationships that respect it, financial choices that sustain it, and practices that keep you connected to the values that motivated the transition. Ask what the new direction requires on an ordinary Tuesday, not during inspiration. Not while announcing change. During an ordinary day when no one is watching. Does it require study, saving, rest, consistent work, honest communication, reduced spending, new boundaries, healthcare, childcare, community, patience? Build around reality. A person may leave a draining profession to create independently, then discover that creative freedom still requires schedules, invoices, marketing, learning, and deadlines. If these ordinary structures are ignored, the new path may become unsustainable, and the old life will appear necessary again. Another person may leave a harmful relationship, then discover that loneliness requires support, healing, and new social habits. Without these structures, the familiar bond may regain power. The door closes securely when the new life has somewhere to stand. The third task is to stop using the transition as your entire identity. At first, leaving may dominate your story. You are the person who changed careers, ended the relationship, moved, awakened, recovered, or began again. This narrative can give meaning and courage, but eventually, the transition itself must become part of the past. A private act of closure may help. You might archive old materials, reorganize a room, return an object, update a document, or mark the date in writing. The act does not create magic. It gives the mind a concrete signal that a decision has entered a new stage. Closure becomes especially useful when the outer world offers no ceremony and no one else understands what has ended. Choose an act that is calm rather than destructive. The purpose is not to erase history or provoke a reaction. It is to align the physical environment with the truth you are already living. You cannot build a whole life around the act of departure. If every conversation returns to what you escaped, the old room remains central. If every decision is designed to prove that leaving was correct, you are still responding to the past. The purpose of crossing was not to spend forever looking backward at the door. It was to enter a larger life. This larger life will contain problems unrelated to the old chapter. New responsibilities will demand attention. You may make mistakes that cannot be blamed on previous conditions. You may discover limits in yourself. This is not evidence that the transition failed. It is evidence that you are living in reality rather than fantasy. The unknown was never promised to be painless. It was offered as a space in which more honest participation became possible. There is also a moment when you must release the desire for everyone from the old life to witness your growth. You may imagine returning with visible success so that those who doubted you will understand. This fantasy can motivate for a time, but it keeps external judgment at the center. Build because the life is yours, not because the past requires a demonstration. Some people will never acknowledge what changed. Some will interpret your growth through their own needs. Some may only remember the version of you that fit their story. Let them remember. Your task is to live, not to control the archive inside another person's mind. Closing the door does not require cutting every connection. You may remain in contact with people from the former chapter. You may continue using skills, traditions, or parts of the old identity. Integration is not erasure. The question is whether these elements support the present or quietly pull you back into automatic roles. A friendship can remain if it allows both people to change. A tradition can remain if it still carries meaning. A skill can become part of the new direction. The past becomes wisdom when it is carried consciously rather than obeyed automatically. Another part of closure is accepting the paths you did not choose. Perhaps you will never know what would have happened if you stayed. The mind may create ideal alternatives, especially during difficulty. It imagines the promotion, reconciliation, status, comfort, or certainty that might have appeared. These imagined futures cannot be tested. Do not allow them to become perfect competitors against the imperfect life you are actually building. Every path contains unseen losses and possibilities. Maturity means committing without pretending that another choice held no value. You can acknowledge that life might have contained good things and still say, "It was not the life I chose to continue." There is peace in ending the trial. You no longer place the present in court each day and demand that it prove the decision beyond all doubt. Instead, you ask what responsibility belongs to the life you are in now. What have I already left emotionally but continue revisiting mentally? What structure must I build so this direction can survive? Which relationships support the person I am practicing becoming? What am I finally willing to stop negotiating with? These questions close the door through action. Consider the person from the opening scene, standing before the room that had become too small. For a long time, one hand remained on the old handle. The person stepped forward, then looked back. Built, then compared. Practiced, then doubted. Now the person turns. The room behind is not dark, it is simply complete. There are objects worth remembering, lessons worth carrying, and people worth loving. But the air belongs to another season. The person does not slam the door. There is no need for violence. The door closes because the life ahead has finally become more real than the fear behind. This is the final meaning of release. Not hatred, not denial, not certainty that every decision was perfect. Release is the willingness to stop asking the past to become the future. When the door closes, you may still hear echoes. You may dream of the old room. You may feel grief on unexpected days. These experiences do not reopen the threshold. They are memory moving through a life that has continued. You have not betrayed who you were. You have allowed that person to complete the work of carrying you here. The unknown is no longer entirely unknown. It has become mornings, responsibilities, relationships, work, mistakes and choices. It has become the path beneath your feet. And the door behind you is no longer an emergency exit. It is part of the architecture of your becoming. And what once looked like an ending now reveals its deeper form. It was the beginning of a life that needed you to stop standing in two rooms at once. Conclusion. The unknown becomes the path. You were never asked to see the entire future. You were asked to become honest enough to recognize when the present could no longer contain your becoming. At the beginning of this journey, the unknown appeared as darkness beyond a door. The room behind you was visible, named, and familiar. It held your history, your competence, your relationships, your sacrifices, and the identity through which others recognized you. The space ahead offered none of these immediate assurances. That is why the threshold felt so difficult. The choice was never simply between comfort and adventure. It was between a known structure that had become too small and a future that could not reveal its shape until you participated in building it. Along the way, you learned that an old life can end quietly. Meaning can withdraw before circumstances collapse. A chapter can complete itself while the furniture remains in place. You learned that familiarity is not the same as safety, and that the mind may protect a predictable form of suffering because it knows how to survive there. You learned that leaving contains grief. The former self was not an enemy. It carried you, protected you, and helped you meet the needs of another season. Growth did not require you to erase that identity. It required you to release its permanent authority. You entered the corridor where labels became uncertain and the new self felt unfinished. You discovered that incompleteness was not failure. It was a temporary space in which old instructions weakened and new evidence began to form. The mind demanded a map. It wanted proof before movement. But you saw that some knowledge belongs only to experience. Preparation could reduce risk, but it could not eliminate vulnerability. The lantern was never meant to illuminate the whole forest. It was meant to reveal the next honest step. You also learned to distrust the false door of escape. Change was not automatically growth. A new environment could not rescue you from every unexamined pattern. The real threshold required responsibility, practical preparation, and a direction larger than the desire for immediate relief. You examined the price of returning. You saw how fear can make the old room look merciful, and how repeated retreat can weaken trust in your own awakening. Yet even a return could become instruction when studied without shame. Then came the first step, without proof. It may not have been dramatic. It may have been a message, a budget, a conversation, an application, a boundary, a class, or a small piece of completed work. But it changed something essential. The new life stopped existing only in imagination. You became a beginner. The new identity felt awkward because it had not yet been practiced. You learned that readiness often follows action. Confidence grew from remembered evidence, the times you moved while fear was still present, corrected without collapse, and repeated what mattered. Eventually, the door began to close behind you, not through hatred, but through integration. The past became a source of wisdom rather than a place of residence. The unknown became ordinary life. This is the point many people misunderstand. They imagine that crossing into a new chapter will create permanent certainty. It will not. The life beyond the known will include difficult mornings, disappointing outcomes, practical burdens, changing relationships, and moments when the old path appears easier in memory. The difference is not that uncertainty disappears. The difference is that you are no longer using certainty as the price of honest movement. You have learned that a meaningful life is not built by controlling every result. It is built by participating consciously in what can be chosen: your preparation, your boundaries, your attention, your actions, your willingness to learn, and your response when the path changes. The room behind you was not a mistake. Perhaps it sheltered you. Perhaps it taught you discipline, endurance, love, skill, or discernment. Perhaps it revealed the exact shape of what you could no longer become. Its value does not depend upon your staying forever. A seed does not dishonor the shell by opening. A traveler does not betray the bridge by reaching the other side. You do not betray your former self by becoming capable of a truth that person could not yet carry. There may still be people who prefer the old version of you. There may be days when you prefer it too. The former identity had familiarity, and familiarity can feel like rest. When that longing appears, do not panic. Remember the whole room. Remember why the door became visible. Then return your attention to the life that now requires you. Ask a simple question. What does this path need from me today? Not for the rest of your life, not for every possible future. Today. Perhaps it needs 1 hour of work, one honest conversation, one refusal, one application, one act of care, one adjustment, one quiet decision not to return to a pattern that has already completed its lesson. The unknown becomes the path through repeated contact. Do not measure the truth of the transition by speed. Some doors open into years of rebuilding. Some changes must unfold around health, family, money, recovery, or responsibilities that cannot be abandoned. Slow movement can still be movement. A careful plan can still be courageous. What matters is that delay serves preparation rather than denial, and that each season contains some honest participation in the direction you have chosen. What once frightened you becomes familiar in a new way. You learn the terrain. You build relationships. You make mistakes and survive them. You discover capacities that could not appear inside the previous structure. You develop a history in the new life. One day, someone may look at you and assume you were always this person. They will not see the corridor, the grief, the sleepless decisions, the returns, the preparations, or the small first actions that created the identity they now recognize. You will know. You will remember that the future did not arrive as a complete revelation. It arrived as a door, a question, and a step. If this journey has helped you recognize a door that has been waiting quietly within your own life, subscribe and remain connected to this path. There are deeper thresholds still ahead, and every honest step prepares you to meet them with greater clarity, courage, and wisdom. Now stand once more before the threshold. Do not ask the unknown to promise that nothing will hurt. Do not ask the past to become false so that leaving will feel easier. Do not demand that fear disappear before your life is allowed to move. Place one hand upon what has carried you. Offer gratitude where gratitude is true. Name the losses without pretending they do not matter. Gather the skills, lessons, and love that still belong to you. Then turn toward what cannot be seen completely. The future will not meet you as a finished answer. It will meet you as material. It will require your labor, your humility, your discernment, and your willingness to revise. It will not save you from being human. It may also surprise you with forms of meaning you could not have planned from the old room. Remain available to that surprise. A path can be responsible without being rigid and clear without becoming closed. It will give your humanity more room. The room behind you was not a mistake. It carried you as far as it could. But you were never meant to remain inside it forever. Place your hand upon the door. Let the old identity release its hold, and step forward into the life that cannot reveal itself until you begin to move.